Good evening, buenas noches, bonsoir, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, Miami Book Fair, and all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Kelsey Haskett to discuss her brilliant translation of Marguerite Duras' The Impudent Ones, published by our friends at the New Press. The New Press is a not-for-profit book publisher with a public interest mission. In its nearly 30-year history, the New Press has published more than 1,000 books, including The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, the national bestseller that has changed the conversation about criminal justice and become a critical text of the Black Lives Matter movement. Now to our guests of honor this evening. Kelsey Haskett was born in London, Ontario, Canada. She completed her MA and PhD in French literature at Laval University in Quebec City. In 1989, she was invited to develop the French program at Trinity Western University, where she also spearheaded the development of the Department of World Languages and Cultures. She then chaired the department from 2003 to 2018 and was responsible as well for developing the major in World Languages and Cultures. She retired at the end of 2019 after 30 years of service to the university. In 2011, she published a major study in French on family relationships in Marguerite Duras' novels, entitled In the Mirror of Her Words. She is also the co-editor of a book with Holly Faith Nelson on French women authors, The Significance of the Spiritual. Haskett is a long-standing member of the Société Internationale Marguerite Duras, as well as the Association Marguerite Duras, situated in Duras, France, in the area where The Impudent Ones is set. To moderate tonight's conversation, we're joined by the wonderful Michael Reynolds. Michael is the editor-in-chief at Europa Editions. Prize-winning and best-selling authors Michael has worked with at Europa include Alina Bronsky, Amelie Nothomb, Elena Ferrante, and Chantal Acevedo, among others. He was born in Australia and now lives in New York. He's the recipient of the 2016 Golden Colophon Award for Superlative Achievement and Leadership in Independent Literary Publishing, awarded by the Community of Literary and Magazine Presses, and a 2017 Epiphany Magazine honoree for publishing excellence. He's the founder of Bookselling Without Borders, a scholarship program that diversifies the culture of reading by building bridges between the American bookselling community and the international book industry. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of The Impudent Ones from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We truly appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. Yes, thank you indeed, Christina, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to Books and Books for hosting this event this evening, and to the New Press for, first of all, for having invited me to moderate this conversation, but have this conversation with you, Kelsey, but also for having brought enthusiastic readers like me this new wonderful novel that we're going to hear a lot more about it during the course of this evening, but I've found it to be a wonderful book. I think any true lover of fiction cannot help but be enthralled and captivated by this novel. So I'm very grateful, as I said, to the New Press for having brought it out. And thanks very much to you, Kelsey, for this wonderful translation, for having rendered in English, in an English that is musical and exact, this wonderful work by Marguerite Duras. think that it's a novel that stands, that fascinates, that enthralls, as I said, very much on its own merits, but certainly one of the things that interests us and that we're going to discuss this evening is where and how it fits into Duras's body of work. To what extent can the seeds of later, perhaps better known works be detected also in this novel, and how perhaps maybe having access now to the Impudent Ones might change how we read her later work. But I want to start with you, Kelsey, and get more of a sense of your work, your approach to translation. How did you first come to Marguerite Duras?
Well, it was almost a little bit indirect in the sense that when I was going to Laval University, a friend of mine was doing an essay on Moderato cantabile by Duras, and she wanted to discuss it with me. She wanted to discuss the ideas in the novel. I think I had read the novel once before, a few years ago. I didn't remember it, and so I thought I'll read the novel again just to help her out so we can discuss it. And so I should say that up until that point, I had been looking for an author to do my doctoral thesis on. And I was kind of in between my master's and my doctorate, and my thesis director had said, be sure and choose an author that you really like because you're going to stay with that author for a long time. She had no idea what she was saying, but anyways, so not in my search, because I started looking at all these authors, and I loved French literature. There were a lot of authors I really liked, but suddenly nothing spoke to me. There was nothing that I felt I could work on, and I was getting really frustrated, but I knew I hadn't found exactly what I was supposed to do yet. So I happened to read this novel by Duras to help my friend with her essay, and voila, when I was reading it, I suddenly felt I can do a lot with this author. I really like this work. I think this is it. I think I found the author that I'm going to do my doctorate on. And so that's how it started, really. I was drawn by the novel. It was kind of the beginning of the new novel phase, the new novel style. And I was interested in the family relationships in the novel, which might sound a little bit strange because there aren't too many. There's just the mother, Anne Desbarres, and her son. It's kind of a symbiotic relationship between the two. And then there's the husband, who is almost absent. But still, I felt there was something about family relationships that I wanted to do, and something about female identity that I wanted to look at. And so I started working on that, started reading other books by Duras, and in fact, that's the author I ended up doing my thesis on.
That constellation, that family constellation that you just described, is a fairly familiar one in Duras's work. Yeah, the symbiotic relationship between mother and son, the somewhat absent father, there but not there. It recurs through in a lot of her novels, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I was just going to say, it's a very short novel, but it has an awful lot of Duras in it. I think it shows a lot of what she's about as a writer.
Did you recognize that immediately as soon as you began reading, or did you build that sense of that novel and how it fits into Duras's oeuvre?
No, I didn't recognize that immediately because that was the first novel I read by her.
Yeah.
And I started to read the other novels, and I saw that there were those elements in all the other novels, but it took me quite a while before I really recognized the significance of that one small novel. I had just felt drawn to it and drawn to the author, and felt there was something there for me, something I could do.
You mentioned to me as we were sort of talking about this event and preparing a few areas of interest, of common interest, that all of Duras's work seems to be based on identity, on her search for self, to some degree. Why did that? Well, two questions, I guess, or a two-part question. Why did that aspect of Duras's work interest you so much as a scholar? And why did it prove so elusive for Duras over the course of her career?
Well, I think it's kind of a long question to answer, but I think that Duras was looking for herself through all her writings. And so she really centered all her writings around her own search for identity, her search for her family identity. In the thesis that I wrote, and then in the book that I wrote on Duras, it was called "In the Mirror of Her Words." So for me, all of Duras' writing was like a mirror of herself, and so there's a very narcissistic theme there, but it was like she was looking in a mirror the whole time and trying to see herself, trying to discover who that person was. And so I found it very interesting. I mean, when I started to read all her novels, I saw aspects of her search that were unique but were universal at the same time. Like I could relate to her as a woman. I could relate to her search for identity and certain things that she discovered. And I could talk a lot about the theme of narcissism. I don't know whether I should do that right now or not, but if people have read The Lover, there's a passage in The Lover where she says, she's like the author, the narrator, saying that that really her whole life she spent looking for her understanding of her relationship with her family, and she says that she still feels that she's in front of a closed door. Do you know that passage? Do you remember?
Yeah.
I could read it if you want, but she says, I never wrote feeling I was writing. I never loved feeling I really was loving. I never did anything except feel that I was behind a closed door. So she feels like there's a mystery that she has to unpack throughout all her works. And they give a lot of reflection. What I did was I studied the different roles that women play in a family. So the mother role, the daughter role, the sister role, the different, and then also outside the family with the lover. And then finally, just the way the female characters in general perceive themselves, because there is a trend throughout the whole thing. And there's this search, there's a lack of self-esteem, a lack of self-worth that starts to come out at the end of The Impudent Ones. I could read a passage at some point if you would like.
Yes, well, perhaps now would be a good moment. You'd mentioned a passage, the passage from page 206. Is that what you were thinking?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So a big part of my book, being as it was called In the Mirror of Her Words, was the theme of narcissism. And the viewers probably remember that the myth of Narcissus was the young man who was looking in a pool of water at his own image, and he became infatuated with his own image to the point where he was sort of glued to it, and he eventually died and turned into the flower that was the Narcissus. But it's this idea of looking in the mirror of self and trying to find self. And in clinical narcissism, the person is actually alienated from themselves and they cannot see themselves in their own image. So this is, there's just this one little passage in this, in The Impudent Ones. At the end of the book, the main character is thinking of turning her brother into the police because the police wanted him for for debt. He was his creditors were after him for debt, and it's kind of her way of striking back at her brother for all the suffering that he's caused her. And so this is, I'll just read this passage. So the thing, she just uses the word, the thing she has to do, that's turning her brother into the police. And she's just on a walk here. She's walking around thinking about what she's going to do later that afternoon. As time went by, she found herself more and more alone, even farther from the familiar shores of her life. The things she had to do gradually took on more importance, while around her everything became vague and blurred and disappeared, as Maud found herself alone with it. This vision didn't stay with her, both annoying and tempting at the same time. It was no different than Maud herself. It was not exactly like a mirror in which she couldn't have avoided seeing herself, but rather the very image of her solitude, a mirror over which she leaned, knowing only that she should have seen herself there, that she was there, without seeing herself. Soon there was nothing but the two of them, this image and herself, in the immense sadness of the world. Maud knew that the only way to have done with the day and everything else was to do the thing she had in mind, which presented itself to her with more and more urgency. But through sheer fear, she didn't yet dare to break this last mooring cable. So this last mooring cable is her relationship with her brother. And so it's just very interesting that she feels like she's leaning over a mirror and knowing she should see herself there, but she can't see herself there. So there's a kind of alienation from her own identity, from her own self. And this will be replayed throughout all of Duras's work. I could give you example after example of.
Yes, I'm sure. No, that's beautiful and beautifully translated. And I'd like to know a little bit more about your work as a translator, if that is a relatively new thing or whether it's always accompanied your scholarship as well.
Actually, translating a book is a new thing for me. This is my first full book to translate. And
congratulations then.
Oh, thank you. I have done a little bit of translating, a little bit of poetry translating, and I was thinking about this. It sort of felt natural to me to launch into this translation. I think it's because as a French professor and teaching Anglophone students, you're often kind of translating things for them. I taught a course in style and composition as well as literature. Most of my courses were literature, but in teaching style and composition, you're helping students understand the elements of style and how to compose, how to write. And so it kind of gives you the elements of translation at the same time, I think, just the elements of writing, period. But I mean, I like literature in both languages. So it just, I guess I just kind of found my way as I was doing it. And there were some like I loved translating certain passages, but there were other places where you would come up against a word that in French might have different meanings, like might have multiple meanings, or it would embrace several ideas at the same time. And if that particular word didn't exist in English, you had to choose which meaning you were going to bring out. And that's a hard choice to make because it's going to determine what you write after that as well. So that was one challenge that I found. And then for this particular work, my editor at the New Press, Diane Wachtel, really helped me see, when she read my own translation, she helped me see the areas where just translating into English what Duras has written in French is not going to be clear enough for the English reader. So then I kind of I had to reflect on that, and I came to a position of meaning and intended meaning. And so sometimes instead of just translating the meaning that's there, I had to go for the intended meaning and maybe add one or two words or a bit of a phrase so that the reader would get more of an understanding of what was going on. So that was kind of
Did you get the sense through the process of translating this book that your scholarship, your work as a scholar, helped or hindered the process of translation? Because it would seem to me that in a certain sense it would add an additional layer of complexity to the work of translation, knowing the scholarship around a given author.
Oh, actually, I think in this particular case, because this isn't a really easy book to understand in French, I think knowing more about Duras helped me make those choices when I had to kind of choose between sort of this meaning or that meaning, what's the intended meaning here. I think my scholarship really helped me at that point. But translation is such a minute job at the same time. You're going word by word, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, that you're not really putting your own interpretation into it, like knowing anything about the past or not knowing anything about the author. I think you have to do the same work to translate it. And I just think knowing more about the author helps you be confident that you're kind of taking things in the right direction.
Can you tell us a little bit about your process with the translation of this book? Did you do a first draft from start to finish? Did you try to perfect each separate section, each part, before moving on? How did you work on this translation?
I would say I tried to perfect each part as I was working on it. Yeah. And then, of course, at the end of each chapter, I would go back and I would work on it more and try to improve the chapter. And then, of course, when I finished the whole book, I read it over and over quite a few times to really try to perfect it. But I did try for my best. I know I didn't do any kind of a rough draft, I don't think. Or maybe just in the very beginning. And then I saw that wasn't going to work. Yeah, that was a long time ago. It's taken me a while to do this. And so I think in the beginning, I kind of thought I could just quickly go through it. But then I saw, no, that's not really what I want to do. I want to really do my best job at every single paragraph as I'm going through. And I think that was, for me, it was the better way to do it. And often I would have a good translation, and I think I'm just going to look up this word or that word in the thesaurus, just in case I find a better word. I use the thesaurus a lot. And, sometimes I'm satisfied with what I've written, but every once in a while you think, oh, that's just the word I was looking for, and so that's the kind of thing I did that took a long time. Yeah.
Given that there are so many recurrences of family dynamics, of particular themes, of certain, let's say, character types also in Duras's body of work, did you feel that you needed to look at other translations of her work to make sure that you were making the right word choices, that there was consensus around a particular translation of a particular idea or concept or dynamic?
No, I mean, I just really, really focused on the French. And I mean, I've read most of Duras's works, at least all her novels, I think. And I have a bookshelf full of literary criticism on Duras. So I felt I kind of had the baggage that I needed to figure out where things were going. And so I just, but I did have times when I had to read the French over and over and over again to really, really be sure of just to give one little example, in French, in dialogues, there's a little dash and then the person says something, and then there's a little dash and the next person says something, and each is a paragraph, but you don't have to say at the end, said John or said
Yeah.
Maud. But when you put that all together into a paragraph in English, you have to say who said it. Otherwise, it doesn't become clear. This is what Diane Wachtel helped me see, that I needed to add replied so-and-so or exclaimed so-and-so in the dialogues. And I think that made it clear in English. But it did take a while sometimes in French to figure out, was this really this person or was it that person? And I mean, later in Duras's work, she purposely leaves a little ambiguity, but I don't think she did in this novel. I think she intended you to understand everything. And what was that question again? Because I did want to say something else. That wasn't my main point.
Yeah, if you felt that it was necessary to look forward or to look at other translations of her work to see if there was some sort of agreed upon terminology for recurring concepts or ideas or family dynamics, anything like that.
No, I just felt I had to sometimes read over and over again. Oh, I know what I was going to say. The one thing that was unfamiliar to me in this particular novel was the setting, because it's set in southwestern France. I mean, I knew the area because I've been there a number of times going to the meetings of the Duras Association. But what I mean is pre-war agricultural society with all its ins and outs and the hierarchies and the protocols and the way people interact, and even just the physical dynamics. Like they had a vineyard, they also had prunes, and they had the prune press and the thing for drying the prunes and heating the prunes. I didn't know that vocabulary. That's a totally different. It was, I mean, when I say pre-war, if you think of the scene where Maud's mother put on this big dinner, this big kind of banquet for all the surrounding farmers, they had coal oil lamps, and they heated with the fireplace, you know, like they were far back, you know. And then after the war, of course, so much was destroyed that France had to really modernize in every area, their industries and agriculture. So I was really going back in time and trying to put myself into the society. That was the hard part, I think, was just understanding the society of the time that she was trying to describe. But now I feel like I'm right in it after
translating. Well, let's talk a little bit more about specifically about the Impudent Ones, and about where specifically I think we should begin with a little bit of historical context. Where does it fit in Duras's career relative to her other books and so on, and why are we only getting it now?
Yeah. Well, I don't know whether I should go back to just telling a bit about her life, maybe. She was born in French Indochina, I think, as most people who know her would be aware of. Her parents were both school teachers in the colonial system. So she was born in 1914. That was before the First World War. France had an empire just like the British had the British Empire. And they looked on themselves as bringing their civilization to other countries. And so her parents were very enthusiastic about their role in this educational system as part of the French colonies. Her father was often ill. Finally, he had to go back to France when she was 7 years old. In 1921, he had to go back to France. He had malaria. He was quite sick. And he didn't get medical permission to return to Vietnam. And so he bought a big house, a great big estate. And he thought this would be for his whole family. He would bring his whole family home. And so that estate is the estate that's in this novel, in fact. Mm-hmm. And he had two sons from a previous marriage. His first wife died, then he remarried, and he had three sons, two sons and Duras in his second marriage. So he's going to bring the 5 children, his wife, and everybody back. But he died in December of 1921 in this home by himself, not with his family. I mean, I think there were a couple of people there, but not anyone close to him. And so The mother, meantime, had a position as a head of a girls' school in Vietnam, so she couldn't leave until the end of the spring, the summer, basically. And so at that point, she took her family to France and to that estate where they lived without the father. And she was there for 2 years. So Duras was there from age 8 to 10. And it obviously had a huge impact on her, because the memories that she has are almost like intact when she describes the different scenes and the people and nature and that kind of thing. But
was this the first time that she had spent time in France?
Yes, she had come over once before, but she was very, very young. And so this was her first time, really. Those 2 years she spent there. And then her mother went back to Vietnam. And so then she spent all her adolescence in Vietnam, and that's where most of the other books are situated. And then she came back to France at age 17 to complete her schooling. She went to the Sorbonne. She studied political science. And so she must have had this book in mind, I think, for a long time, because when she started it in about 1940, France had just been invaded and was under German occupation. And you can tell it has no reflection of that society she was living in at all. It's really her memories of the past. So this is her very first book. She has written another book that was, she worked for the French, what was it? The colonial department, something like that. And so for their propaganda purposes, she had written a book called L'Empire Français, the French Empire. And that was just purely for that work. But this was her first novel, and she started writing it during this occupation period, and came out with this book that totally describes her younger years. Oh, I forgot to mention, her mother did come back with the children when she was 17, before she went to university. Her mother sold the estate, so they spent like maybe a month or so there while she was selling the estate, and it was pretty run down. So they stayed with their neighbors, just like the Becquest family.
Okay.
With the Becquest family, it was the a name a bit similar to that. So it just escapes me. And there was a young man, I think, in that family who was interested in Maud. And Jean Vallier says in his biography that this family could have very easily been interested in Duras, in Marguerite, because marrying her would have helped consolidate the properties as well. So very much like in the novel. Yeah.
This was the first novel that she wrote. Was it the first novel of hers that was published? It was.
It was her first novel. It wasn't accepted in the beginning by the two publishers. She reworked it a bit. Funny, it was accepted by Plon in French, and that was 1942, I think. Was it 42 or 43? I think it was 1942. It was accepted finally, and it wasn't. I mean, some people that read it thought that she showed real promise as a writer, but the book in itself wasn't really raved about at the time. But there were very there were excellent critics like Raymond Queneau who really saw something in Duras at the time, and Raymond Fernandez as well, who gave it a favorable review. And so so it's just interesting because this is the only novel that she sets in that setting. She has one other novel, her next novel, is set sort of in the countryside in France. And then after that, everything else pretty well is in Asia, Indo-Asia, that whole area.
Apart from the difference of settings and length as well, where is this novel very different from the novels that she was writing later in her career? stylistically speaking. You seem to find more similarities than differences in your afterword, or is that a misrepresentation of what you said?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, I find a lot of similarities, and I find them more and more. Even just preparing for this interview, I was going through The Lover. I only have her books in French. I've never read any other book by her in English. And all of a sudden I was discovering these wonderful descriptive paragraphs that I hadn't really paid a lot of attention to before. So that's certainly something that carries over. And in other of her books, I've noticed the quality of description. But in terms of the basic narrative style, she does evolve quite a bit. I think her second novel is similar, but you can tell there's progress. And then when she starts to write her books on Indochina, there's a tone that's different. There's a style that's different. I think there's two things. I mean, I'm just kind of thinking out loud right now. I think one, outside of literary factors, she has just done political studies at the Sorbonne University. And I think she's a little bit politicized after that, in the sense that her first big success was The Seawall. I don't know whether you know that book or not. The Seawall, yeah, where she really, instead of promoting the French Empire as she did in that book she had to write for the colonial office, suddenly her mother, the tables are turned upside down, and her mother is the victim of the colonial system. And so there's no sense of white privilege in this book at all. There's the sense of her mother being the victim and fighting against the colonial agents, and being a woman and not having the same privileges as men, the same salary and all of that. And you sense that, and her mother also fighting to kind of help the indigenous people in the novel. So, taking their side on things. So you see there's a kind of switch in a mentality as far as the French Empire was concerned. And I think that kind of stays with Duras. I mean, most of these writers like Duras and the other writers of the 40s, Sartre, Camus, they all joined the Communist Party because they felt that was the only way to fight fascism. Most of them were kicked out eventually, except for Sartre, but because they were too independent. But that's one aspect, I think, that changes, and the idea of being a bit more radical, a bit more rebellious. But there's also the influence of the changing times in novel writing with Robe Grillet and the new novel style, and the idea, getting away from the 19th century novel style, and the idea of letting the reader interpret what you're saying, of not really stating exactly what you mean, but letting. And so in her novels, like in Marguerite au Cantabile, sentence by sentence, you're trying to interpret what's being said and why, and what's happening and why, and the reader has to really participate with the author to kind of figure out what's going on. And it's never definitive in the end. It's always left up to the reader in the end. So she becomes a master at that, I would say, with Marguerite au Cantabile. But she doesn't just stay with that style. Like, she just adapts it to her own purposes and her own kind of quest for identity and for what she's looking for. She adapts that style. So she doesn't really consider herself a new novelist in the end. And I think most people would agree she has kind of a unique style.
One of the influences on this novel that is mentioned a couple of times in the afterwards, and I think in a couple of reviews for this book, is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Do you see that influence there?
Personally, I don't. I've seen that a couple of times.
Yeah.
And, I don't really see that myself. I see a little bit of influence of Mauriac, who was a French author, very well known at that period, and won a Nobel Prize for Literature. And he had kind of very somber, austere looks at the bourgeois society, and usually a female character going through some personal drama. So I think there certainly probably was some influence of Mauriac, but I don't see Wuthering Heights as having the same kind of dynamic, to be honest, with you. Yeah.
We should say a little bit about the dynamic in question here. This book, I'm assuming, I'm hoping that there are many people listening who haven't yet read the book and will go to buy it this evening at Books and Books. But it is the story of a family, if we haven't gleaned that already, the Grant Taneran family, a mother with two grown children, Maud and Jacques. Children from her first marriage to Monsieur Grant. Her new husband, Taneran, is a sort of fairly marginal figure that we kind of mentioned before. But they have a child of the second marriage, Henry, the youngest son. And perhaps of sort of greatest importance, in order to summarize the story, Jacques, the oldest child here, is sort of close to 40 and is living a wretched, dissolute life in Paris when the story opens. His new wife, whom he and the rest of the family, I think we assume, sort of hoped would maybe get them out of debt and also get him on the right path, has been killed in an accident. And following this death, the mother decides that she will move them to the country in an effort to sort of, I suppose, protect Jacques from the influences of the big bad city. But things don't quite go as planned in the country. The country, in a certain sense, is where Jacques' worst tendencies come out. And the worst tendencies of the rest of the family. So it's divided. The book is divided into these three parts. The first part and the third part in Paris, the central and longest part of the book, in the countryside around the dilapidated family estate in southwestern France. The family seems trapped, I think is the best word, in this sort of destructive dynamic, a tangle of resentments and disappointments that really lends this book all of its sort of narrative tension. What is your best guess at Duras's own feelings about the sort of the source of that tension? Is that a priori the family constellation has that resentment and that tension, or has something happened off scene in this book that we don't quite see?
This is the tension that goes through all of her works. Like there's a passage in The Lover that I just read today, and she talks about this relationship of love and hate in her family and how destructive it is. And basically, it stems from, I think, this kind of a dysfunctional family because of the codependent relationship between the mother and this older son who she's always enabling. And he's a gambler and he loses money all the time and he's borrowing from the family all the time, but she's always enabling him. And she seems to love him the best, to the detriment of the daughter and the younger son. And so it's a frustration for the daughter, besides which this older brother, Jacques, is quite mean. He's very authoritative, and he's kind of trying to get back at Maud for certain things. And she's fearful of him at the same time as hating him, at the same time as feeling the family solidarity. So it is a kind of a complex situation because there's this sort of family sort of solidarity, but it's a very dysfunctional family, and she wants to get out of it, but she's afraid to get out of it, like in that little passage that I read. And so basically the other stories, like if you skip to the seawall, you see the mother, and so this is in Vietnam. In French Indochina, you see the mother and the son who are always kind of in cahoots, and the mother who takes out her frustration on the daughter who she beats at times, and the brother's there looking on and, you know, encouraging the mother to discipline the daughter. And yet the daughter and the mother, when the brother's out hunting at night and doesn't come home, they're both united in their fear about what might have happened to him. So this goes on and then you see that in the lover, you see the love-hate relationship that she actually mentions using those terms in regard to the older brother and the mother. The younger brother becomes, starting in the second novel, The Quiet Life, the younger brother becomes like the one that she shows her affection to. He's the one that she can love, and she treats him as her child almost. She looks at him as kind of someone that's hers and that she can love. And so this pattern, it repeats itself, and even in fiction, in the fictional work, you see characters that resemble these characters not in their family relationship, but just in the fact that they act in the same ways.
I remember a very striking description from the lover. I can't remember at what point in the book, where she describes her family as being, they're like stone. They're made out of stone or rock. I can't remember the word that is used in the translation. And they're just sort of banging against each other in this sort of futile effort to draw emotion and draw affection out of each other, and it doesn't work.
That's right. And you see, part of the narcissistic tendency is a feeling of being rejected, especially being rejected by the mother, and having a loss of self-worth, and trying to find this love and this identity, which Duras, you sense, never really finds in her family throughout. Yeah, I feel like I wanted to say a little bit more about that. She's sort of alienated from her family and then alienated from herself. And if you look at the Vice Consul, for example, where you have three main characters, you have the beggar woman, and then you have who is the absolute image of self-dispossession and destruction. Her mother has sent her away from home because she's become pregnant, and she's forced into begging and prostitution, and her whole physical body breaks down. She loses her hair and she's skinny. She's like a skeleton, and then her inner identity disappears. She loses her language and everything. And then you have the French ambassador's wife, who's the ideal of perfection. She's this beautiful femme fatale. But there's a parallel between the two. By the time you get to the end, you feel that the beggar woman is kind of the spiritual image, the inner image of really this beautiful woman who has this deep sense of alienation within herself as well. There's the Vice Consul, which is the title of the book. He is also this kind of a strange man who he's on probation. He's in part of the diplomatic corps, the French diplomatic corps. He's been in Lahore. The book takes place in Calcutta, and he was found shooting at lepers from his balcony in the park across. But then also you read that he was shooting at himself in the mirror.
Yeah.
And so you feel like that narcissistic image again. It's almost like he saw himself in the lepers, because you can't understand why would anybody shoot at lepers. But he too has this kind of alienation, this violent side. He, at a certain point, there's a big ball given by Anne-Marie Strater, the ambassador's wife, and he comes and he yells out. He yells at the end of the ball that he wants to stay there with her, and I think he is kind of an image of the older brother, actually. This kind of
Yeah.
impudent
Yeah.
person. And so you see, even in the fiction, you see the reproduction of these character types throughout Duras.
Yes, because very often the older brother, and I think this is true certainly in the Impudent Ones, there are moments of willful cruelty on the part of the older brother, but just as often there's this sort of unwilled cruelty that just seems to drag him along, and almost unconscious or subconscious will to cruelty
Yeah,
at times.
yeah. He is a very strange type of personage, which I think maybe explains why Duras was kind of fascinated by him, and I
Yeah.
mean, very moved by him. She suffered a lot because of him, but she still couldn't get away from trying to figure it all out throughout all her works, I think. Why was the mother so attached to him and not her? And just that sense of rejection as a daughter. She's still trying to figure it out in the lover and right to the end.
Is there, again, going back to Kelsey as a scholar, I as I said, I think this is a very fine novel, perhaps true, sort of tending more in the direction of the 19th century novel, the great, the narratively, structurally, I think, different in some ways from her later novels. But can it also be read as a key to her later novels? Is there something that changes about the way that you see the later novels now, having worked on this book?
I think so. I think, for one thing, it reinforces the absolute importance of the family to Duras, because that was her choice of topic in her very first novel. And it shows the family in probably what you might call a more realistic way. Whereas if you get into novels like The Seawall, it's a bit more extreme, or there's more characterization, like bolder characterization with other future novels. But to me, this kind of gives a picture of what her life was maybe more like in this particular novel. And so, I mean, because of the film that was made of The Lover, everybody thinks of the erotic side of that novel. But actually, if you look at the actual text, it's just as much about the family, and it's always this tug and pull between the family and between the lover, and back and forth. And so reading this first novel, The Impudent Ones, shows me that really at the heart of Duras' work, again, is the family. That's really, really important. And I think it shows a closer relationship between Maud and the mother. So the female protagonist and the mother don't have this hugely antagonistic relationship. They just have a kind of a stress and a strain in their relationship, but there is some love there. And so I feel that maybe this is a book that sets the groundwork, but then maybe certain emotions grew with time and caused the same characters to develop in a little bit more extreme ways. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
So I think this book is important because, I mean, my book was my thesis was on the family relationships and female identity in the novels of Duras. And strangely enough, I didn't start with this book because it wasn't in her list of books at the beginning. It was omitted from her bibliographies. And so I started with the next book, and nobody was talking about this book at that time. And now I read it and I think this absolutely should have been the very first book in the novels that I studied. But now I'm discovering it all these years later. I mean, I just read it once and I thought, no, I'm not, nobody is even talking about this book. I'm not going to put it in there. But now I think I should have. Yeah.
Do we know why it was omitted for such a long time?
I think it was because Duras herself did not, I think she felt embarrassed about her writing in this novel as she changed her style and became known as you know, kind of almost like a new novelist, a person whose style was kind of pared down to the essentials and who described feelings and things without describing them. Like she uses space, like in Moderato Cantabile, there's the inner space where people feel kind of suffocated, and then there's the outer spaces, and she uses all of that to infer, you know, what the characters are feeling. And so this is just a much more, like you say, a 19th century structure of a book. And I think she was kind of embarrassed because it wasn't her style, so she cut it out. She never talked about it, or once in a while she did, and she criticized it. So I think that's what happened. And finally, in the end, people wanted to read it just because it was part of her work.
And thank goodness, because it's wonderful. There was, or there is, a very beautiful passage that we'd discussed on page 148 that I think indicates not only her descriptive powers, but also how Duras used description so brilliantly within sort of the narrative economy of her storytelling. And I wondered if we might sort of close with that reading.
Okay. Yes, I'd be happy to read that.
Thank you.
This is on page 148, if anyone has the book. And this talks about two friends, Maud and her friend. They're both about 20 years old, and so we don't need to say more than that. Louise rolled over on her back and looked at the sky, her eyes blinking. They really didn't have anything to say to each other. Both recognized that their friendship no longer existed, that since their childhood, and in spite of what they might have done to encourage it, their feelings had turned into an extreme dislike. It was a fine day in June, despite the heat. Because of the recent rains, the grass was thick and luscious, and the air gave off the fragrance of sap. Thrushes flew low over the fields, and the velvety whir of their wings made a rustling noise. From the tops of the tall poplar trees of the Riator, goldfinches were singing, infusing the azure sky with their voluptuous, triumphant notes. The cries of other birds rang out far and near, piercing or modulating, and one had to listen carefully to distinguish a single cry from so many. Surrounded by the woods of Udren, the silence seems to repose on these innumerable murmurs of birds. Sometimes, similar to the unfolding of a dying wave, puffs of warm air traverse the foliage of the trees. Without warning, the bells of the Pardel rang out. Not a particle of air escaped their vibration. Not a blade of grass or a leaf failed to quiver. As Maud didn't move, Louise sat up, this time authoritatively. Her mouth tightened with sudden anger, and she cried out, "Well, vespers are sounding. Don't forget what you promised. If I want to be there when people are leaving, we have to leave right away." So that was the passage.
Thank you. That's beautiful writing, brilliant storytelling, and a wonderful translation. Thank you.
Thanks.
And Christina, I don't know if you're still out there. Will you join us? There you are.
I'm here. So thank you so much. That's really wonderful. I've learned a lot, as I think our viewers have as well. So I just want to thank you both for joining us in our virtual bookshop tonight. Thank you, Kelsey, for your translation. Thank you, Michael, for moderating so beautifully. And I hope that I will see you in person sometime soon in Miami, maybe, and we can see one another there. I want to remind everyone watching that you can order a copy of the book by just pressing the green button at the bottom of the screen, and we will ship it to you gladly. If you're in Miami and you'd like to pass by one of our stores and pick up a copy, you can do that too. And thank you so much for joining us and for your interest in Marguerite Duras. Thank you, and good night. Bye.
Thank you, Christina. Bye, Kelsey.
Goodbye.